when we think as nutritional scientists, okay, what can we do to improve someone's health that actually has minimal impact on how they live our lives? Because food's got to be enjoyed, it can't be a burden. So actually, if you could change your snacks, given that they're a quarter of your calorie intake for most people, that's a really simple dietary strategy to improve your health.
Dr. Sarah Berry, welcome to The Genius Life. How you doing?
Good, thank you for having me.
I love the fact that we're here together in person. I'm a fan of yours. I've been watching, absorbing all of your content on the Zoe portal, and I love all the research that you've done. So I'm super excited to get into it, to get into your background. But I want to start high level with a topic that I think is super important with regards to nutrition that nobody seems to be talking about. And this is an area of your a main focus for you in terms of your research focus, and it is the food matrix. What is that?
So I'm talking about the food matrix a lot, but like you say, lots of other people aren't. And the food matrix, really simply put, is the structure of a food. So in nutritional science, and also, as consumers, we think about nutrition and we think about the health effects of foods, all about the nutrients that are in it, the fat, the protein, the fiber and carbohydrate. No one ever considers the structure of the food. Yet what we know from my research and other research is the structure of the food actually modulates how those different nutrients impact your health. And we're now really starting to understand just what a big impact the food matrix can have in terms of how you respond to a food.
It's incredible. And the food matrix is not something that you get any sense in terms of its quality from the nutrition facts label. It's something completely independent of macros, right? The things that people are obsessed with, which is carbs, protein, fat.
Absolutely. And I think nuts is a really great way to illustrate actually how limited back-of-pack labeling is, because it doesn't consider the food matrix.
Wow. And why? So why is that? Nuts.
Okay, and I'm using nuts as an example, but this applies to lots of other foods that we can delve into if you want to. So let's take an almond nut, for example. If you were to look on the back-of-pack labelling for an almond nut, it would say that there are about 6.5 calories per gram of nuts. Okay, and so the perception, therefore, is, these are really high calorie. Lots of people don't eat nuts because they're like, oh my God, I'm getting all of this fat from these nuts. They're really energy dense, so they've got lots of energy per gram of nut. But actually what we know is, because of the food matrix, and I'll come back to explain why, that actually you don't absorb all of those calories. You actually absorb on average about 30% less calories from the nuts. So actually that back-of-pack labeling really is not very meaningful in terms of how your body processes and how much of the nut your body processes.
So it's kind of a lie in a way.
It's true in terms of if you were to analyze it in a lab, but it's a lie in terms of what your body does with the food.
Fascinating. So, okay, nuts, massive category, lots of different types of nuts and lots of different forms in which we might choose to ingest nuts, right? So on the spectrum of you've got whole nuts, you've got nut butters, you've got nut milks. How does the different forms that we tend to see nuts in our local supermarkets impact the way that we digest them?
So this is something we've looked at in our studies, and we've looked at it a number of different ways. So we've been doing studies that we call mastication studies, which are like these chew and spit studies, where we get people to chew different types of nuts. They spit out, at the point that they're about to swallow, they spit the nuts out. And we look at how much of the different fats are released. We also do studies where we collect what we call stoma, so from ileostomy patients who are missing the last bit of their intestine, and we look, again, following different types of nuts, how much energy and how much fat is there. And then we also do studies where we collect poo and look at the poo. And I must tell you, actually, the chew and spit studies are the worst ones.
Worse than collecting poo?
They are, actually.
Wow, that I would not have thought.
Fortunately, I've reached a stage in my career where I don't have to do any of this myself.
Thankfully.
But what's really interesting is we see that when you chew nuts, that actually most of the fat from the nuts is remaining intact in the cell walls. And this is where the matrix is so special. And so all plants have cell walls. And the nutrients are generally contained within those cell walls. So the cell walls of nuts are very rigid structures, and within the cell walls is where all the fat is contained. Now, the cells in nuts are tiny. They're about 50 microliters or less, 50 micrometers or less. They're tiny, minuscule, like smaller than a grain of sand.
Wow.
So that means when you chew the nuts, you fracture some of these cells. So you break some of these cells and the lipid can burst out of some of these cells. But actually, most of them remain intact, because from our chew and spit studies, if you eat a whole almond nut, the particles that you spit out are about 1.5 millimeter size. So you're only actually releasing the fat from the surface of that 1.5 millimeter chunk. So what happens is at the point at which you swallow the almond that you've just chewed, you're only releasing about 10% of the fat. All the rest is contained within these cell walls.
Wow.
Okay. As it passes through your gastrointestinal tract, then you can absorb some of the nutrients. So some of the enzymes in your gut can break down some of the cell walls. But what we find is when we collect this effluent that comes out at the lower part of the gut, so when we feed almonds, for example, to ileostomy patients, we still see that actually only about 30% about 60% of the fat is released. So you've still got 30% to 35% that's actually within these cell walls. And that then goes on to your large intestine. It's great food for your microbiome, which feeds away at the cell walls, at the fat that's contained within it. But that's why we know that the back-of-pack labelling overestimates the energy value by about 30%, because it's just coming out the other end because of the way these cell walls are structured. Now, if you process the food, then that's going to change the amount that's released. And there's different ways we can process nuts, for example. So we can chop them, we can grind them, we can put them in butters. And so there's been quite a bit of work where people have looked at how much energy is released from whole nuts versus ground nuts versus sliced nut. And you do see that there's more energy released when you chop them, when you slice them, and also when you grind them into butter. And so this is where it gets quite interesting. If you were to commercially grind the nuts so that you break all of those cell walls, and I'm talking about like really grinding so that you're breaking them into less than that 50 micrometer size cell, then you're going to release all the fat. So then they become, the back-of-pack labelling then would be accurate. If you do it at home, and this is what people often ask me, but what about the nut butter I make at home or when I grind the nuts at home? Then using most processors that you would use at home to grind the nuts, you'll still find that about 20 to 25% of the fat actually is coming out and the energy is coming out the other end. So you'd still find that it's not very accurate to look at the back-of-pack labelling versus actually what you're absorbing.
Well, I think therein lies like one of the defining characteristics of an ultra processed food, right? Like an ultra processed food isn't something that you could conceivably make in your own, like in a typical home kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done studies where we fed individuals whole nuts, we've fed individuals ground nuts, and then also a study where we fed individual nuts where in order to actually extract all the fat, we had to use a commercial process, that it just wasn't possible in a kind of kitchen setting to actually fully grind the nuts. And then when you look at how much of the energy is excreted the other end, when you have the whole nuts, like I've said, it's about 30 to 35% that comes out the other end. When you have the kind of nuts that you would grind at home, then you're getting about 20% still coming out. But if you go to the commercial process that's used not for all nut butters, but for some nut butters, and where it's literally fracturing all those cells, then you get about 98% absorption. So you only have about 2% of the energy coming out.
Wow. So is this one of the reasons why ultra processed foods seem to be, I mean, I'm sure there are many reasons which you can speak to, but like at least one of the reasons why our increased consumption of these types of foods seem to be correlated so strongly with various disease outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think with ultra processed foods, there's a number of reasons. And so the breaking up of the food matrix, the breaking up of the structure of the food, I think is a really key mechanism. I think it's a mechanism that people don't often talk about in relation to ultra processed food. People are very focused on the fact that ultra processed foods has more unhealthy nutrients. So we know it has, higher saturated fat, lower fiber, higher salt, higher added sugar. people always talk about ultra-processed foods in relation to additives, emulsifiers, colorants, etc. But what people don't talk enough about is the fact that ultra-processed foods change the structure of the food. They often destroy this food matrix. And I've used nuts as a quite puristic example, but it applies if we take, for example, whole large oats, and we've done research where we've fed individuals whole large oats. We've then fed individuals exactly the same oats, but we've ground them. Okay, so again, back of pack labeling would say, hey, these are 2 identical meals. And on the day that we feed these people for breakfast, they'll have fasted overnight the whole large oats. What happens is they have a very small rise in what we call postprandial glycemia. So it's the post-meal blood sugar response. So it's quite blunted. It's like this very small rise. They stay fuller for longer, etc. When you give them exactly the same ones, but they're ground, so the structure's changed, the matrix is destroyed, you have this really quick rise in blood sugar. Then you have this big drop causing, this kind of post-meal blood sugar dip. Now, back of pack labeling would say they're the same.
Same calories, same macros.
Everything's the same.
But a dramatically different physiological
All you've done
response.
is change. And the same applies for nuts, for example. And so one of my first studies that I ever did at King's College London was feeding individuals whole almond nuts, feeding them ground almond nuts, and looking at something that we call postprandial lipemia. And so this is basically the increase in blood fat after consuming a fatty meal.
This episode of the show is sponsored by House of Macadamias. I'm a huge fan of macadamia nuts, but they've always been cost prohibitive. They've always been the most premium and expensive nut. That's why I'm super glad that House of Macadamias is now making macadamia nuts easily accessible to all. They've partnered with farmers in South Africa to democratize macadamia nuts, making macadamia nuts finally affordable. Macadamias are incredible. They're super high in healthy monounsaturated fat. They are vegan, keto, and paleo approved. And House of Macadamias makes all kinds of macadamia-based products. You can get dry roasted macadamias, which are my personal favorite. They come in a myriad of different flavors, like zesty salsa flavor. They are 10 out of 10 delicious. And if you go to houseofmacadamias.com and use promo code MAX, you'll get 20% off of your order. Thank you so much, House of Macadamias, for sponsoring this episode of the show.
And like postprandial glycemia, so the increase in blood sugar after a carbohydrate-containing meal, we know that postprandial lipemia is linked to cardiovascular disease. And what we did is we found that when people ate the whole almonds, you had a really blunted, so very small rise in this circulating what we call triglycerides, so the fat from the nuts. But when we fed them the really finely ground almonds that use the commercial process, so this is using a commercial process where all the cells were split, you had this massive increase in circulating blood fat. And we know this is bad for us because it initiates a whole cascade of downstream effects such as inflammation, oxidative stress, and many more metabolites are produced that we know are bad for us. But again, back of pack labeling would have said, hey, these are 2 identical foods. That's just changing the structure.
Wow.
And so this is one of the reasons that ultra-processed foods, I think, can have an unfavourable impact on our health.
I've heard about the distinction between cellular and acellular nutrients. I've heard mainly in the context of carbohydrates, like cellular versus acellular carbs, like glucose wrapped up in these like plant cell walls, but never in the context of fat, which is a new way to think about this.
Yeah, and I think if we use the almonds and the oats as an example, the almonds is an example where the cell walls, and remember cell walls are actually fibre, that's what fibre is, cell wall. So the fibre, the cell walls are actually reducing the amount of energy that you're absorbing, but also as a byproduct of that, reducing these post-meal increases in blood fat that we know have all of these unfavourable effects. With oats, so the more carbohydrate-rich plant foods, what tends to happen is the structure, the matrix, the cell walls tend to not prevent the calories being absorbed, but they tend to slow it down.
Hmm.
So I often think about it as a fast food versus a slow food. You're changing a slow food, which is how nature intended it to be, to a fast food that, whoa, you're flooding the system. You've got this big peak setting off these like inflammatory fires, etc. You're getting this dip that we know from our own research can impact hunger, energy intake, and that's just from changing that structure.
Amazing.
I think I've been doing this the last 20 years, so I love talking about.
No, I love it. It's so cool because it can impact it impacts satiety. It impacts, the postprandial like blood sugar, post-meal blood sugar spike and subsequent dip can be modulated purely by like the quality of the food that you're eating.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that we think that nuts, despite being really energy dense, so again, this perception that, I can't eat nuts, they've got loads of fat in them, that actually we know that people that consume lots of nuts tend to have lower body mass index. They tend to have lower weight, lower waist circumference, less visceral fat, so they're kind of bad fat in our body. We also know if we put people on a high nut diet, so we know from randomized controlled trials, if we give people lots of nuts to eat, they don't put on weight.
That's crazy because they are very calorie dense foods.
Yeah, because one of the magic things, as well as the matrix, is that they increase satiety. They make you feel fuller. So they do lots of these wonderful things. That's because of not just the nutrient composition of nuts, which is great, but because of the structure. So you get these large particles in your stomach that delays gastric emptying, so it delays the rate that your stomach empties all the contents. You blunt that post-meal sugar response that we know is bad for us, and they enter your bloodstream more slowly, so you feel fuller for a lot longer.
Wow. And this is true for nuts, but it's also true, would you agree, for pretty much every other type of food category? I mean, for fruit, for vegetables, for even meat, like there's a difference probably between consuming like a steak versus like ground beef, in terms of how we digest and assimilate those foods.
Yeah, I don't know much about how processing different meats impacts how we metabolize it, but you're right in saying this applies to so many different foods, and I think it's something we need to think more and more about. And I often say to people when they say, oh, how do I know whether I should eat this food? Is it good or bad for us? I would often say, don't look at back-of-pack labeling. Is the food in the original way in which it was intended to be eaten? And so there's work from many years ago looking at apples, for example, looking at apples that are just pureed. So again, identical back-of-pack labeling. And then also looking at apples where they've had the juice extracted. And the impact that they have depending on whether they're eaten whole, eaten pureed, or eaten with just the juice, so without the fibre, in terms of our post-meal responses, so the gut hormones that are telling us how full or hungry we are, our glucose, it's vastly different.
So interesting. Going back to nuts, are nuts at the end of the day like a healthful food? Because today on social media, nutrition is, I've never seen a more polarized topic than nutrition.
It's start looking on Twitter about ultra-processed food,
yeah.
and then you will.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's crazy. Like people have such strong opinions. I posted recently about my love for almonds, for example, and I happen to love macadamia nuts. Like I'm a huge macadamia nut fan. But on social media, you get now with the rise of the carnivore diet, which no shade against people who are seeing symptom relief on, the carnivore diet, which is like, in my view, the ultimate elimination diet. But nonetheless, there's a lot of, I think, misinformation about nuts. For example, people will say that almonds are loaded with like oxalates and anti-nutrients and that, we're better off avoiding them altogether. What's your take on that?
I think it's nonsense. I think that the evidence is so clear that nuts are healthy for us, that nuts are a fantastic addition to our diet for a number of reasons. So nuts are packed full of healthy nutrients. So they've got great macronutrients, they've got loads of fibre, which I don't think anyone can dispute is good for us. They're packed full of healthy fats, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, which again, I don't think anyone can dispute are good for us unless you're some seed oil hating nutter. But that's another podcast. I'd love to.
Yeah, we can.
I'd love to go head to head actually with some of these seed oil haters. But anyway, I digress. They're they're packed with micronutrients. So, vitamins like vitamin E, selenium, magnesium, so many great micronutrients. They're packed with polyphenols. So these are like bioactive chemicals that have, far-reaching effects throughout our health. And all of the RCTs clearly showed that the nuts, when added to our diet, improve our health. They improve inflammation. They improve blood lipids. So, for example, they reduce LDL, bad cholesterol, reduce triglycerides. They also change the types of cholesterol that are circulating in our body. They improve vascular function. And they improve heart rate variability. There's so many different ways that nuts improve our health. And I've done lots of different studies looking at nuts, how it affects our health in the short term, depending on the matrix. But also I've done a large study where we just looked at feeding nuts versus typical snacks, how that impacted lots of different health outcomes. And I'd be happy to summarise.
Yeah, please.
Talk to you a little about that. Okay. So this was a study called ATTIS. And we randomly recruited 100 people to either consume 20% of their energy as almond nuts or 20% of their energy as typical snacks. Now, we chose 20% as an energy exchange because we know that people consume about 20% of their energy from snacks. So in
Snacks.
In the UK and
Wow.
the US, about 20 to 25% of our energy comes from snacks. That's huge. That's like a quarter of our energy. So when we think as nutritional scientists, okay, what can we do to improve someone's health that actually has minimal impact on how they live our lives? Because food's got to be enjoyed. It can't be a burden. So actually, if you could change your snacks, given that they're a quarter of your calorie intake for most people, that's a really simple dietary strategy to improve your health. And the reason it's simple is also because snacks tend to be eaten in isolation. So when I have my evening dinner, it's dictated by either what my husband's cooking or what my kids want to eat. When I have my lunch, it's depending on, who I'm out with at work that day. But snacks is something I have control over. And so it's a really simple strategy. And so we decided that what we would do is we would recruit people who are typical snackers in the UK, so typically consuming 2 to 3 snacks a day, having 20% of their energy from snacks. And we would ask them to either have 20% of their energy from nuts, so that's about 60 grams of nuts, so a couple of portions of nuts, so a couple of handfuls of nuts a day. Or we actually gave them a typical UK snack. So we did a lot of work working out what is a typical UK and US snack. So it's a little bit of some crisps, it's a little bit of a chocolate bar, it's a little bit of a pastry. And we worked out the nutrient profile and we actually created our own snacks in our dietetic kitchen, cooked thousands of these snacks, and we asked people to either have these or have the nuts, and we followed them for 6 weeks. And at the end of the 6 weeks, we looked at lots of different outcomes related to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. And what we found was, as well as confirming what previous researchers have found, that it reduces your blood lipids, so it reduces your bad cholesterol, we also found that it improved something called endothelial function. And endothelial function is a measure of your vascular function, of your blood vessel function. So your blood vessels are lined with these very special cells called the endothelial cells. And we know that any damage to the endothelial cells is that first underlying damage that goes on to develop into cardiovascular disease. And we found a really big improvement in the group taking the nuts in endothelial function, so in blood vessel function, compared to those having the control snacks. And when you extrapolate the actual downstream impact this might have on cardiovascular disease risk, this is estimated to result in about a 30% reduction in cardiovascular disease risk based just on this impact it had on this blood vessel function. Another really interesting finding is that we saw that it also impacted something called heart rate variability. I don't know if you're familiar with that as a measure.
I'm familiar with unpack that term. What is that?
So heart rate variability is quite a novel measure that we're getting quite excited about in the field of nutrition and health. And it's a measure actually you can also measure yourself if you have certain wearables. So for example, many of the watches that people wear or some of these rings that people wear that are sensing heart rate variability. And heart rate variability, really simply put, is a measure of how responsive your heart is to physiological stimuli. And so if your heart's not doing that great, your heart rate variability will be quite low. So if I was to clap my hands like that, you might not feel that anything's changed, but hopefully your heart might have just changed a tiny bit
Yeah.
in terms of, increased or reduced some of the beat to beat, so time.
It's just like how agile your heart is when it comes to like the pressures and demands of modern life.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we found is found that nighttime heart rate variability was lower for people that had the almond intervention. But interestingly, we also asked people to do a stress test where we intentionally stress them out. So they're in our clinic and we get them to look at all of these different colours and numbers and have to shout out really quickly, and they go faster and faster. So, it gets them quite stressed. And what we found is that the people that were having the almonds had a better heart rate variability to the stress test than the people that didn't have the almonds.
Wow.
And that's an entirely different mechanism to all of these other things that we've just talked about. And given that the majority of us live quite a stressed life now,
Yeah.
it's great to know it also might impact our stress response as well.
That's amazing. I also, I think like when I think about improving heart rate variability, I think primarily of like exercise. What exercise modality can I adopt to improve that? That a food can potentially improve HRV? That's pretty astonishing.
Yeah, there hasn't been that much work looking at how food impacts heart rate variability, but I think that we'll see lots more studies emerging. And it's not just our group that saw that nuts favourably impacted heart rate variability. There's been a study with pistachios as well that also saw the same, that in response to a stress test, where they stressed people out, there was a favourable effect in those consuming the pistachios versus a control in heart rate.
Is any one nut healthier than another, or do they all have unique and distinct health benefits?
So I think, in my opinion, all nuts are healthy. Okay, not the ones that you might get in the pub that are laden with salt, and not perhaps the ones that are covered in chocolate, although I still think that's a better snack than a typical snack. They have different attributes. Now, generally, they all have really good fat profiles. So generally, they're high in unsaturated fats, but they do have slightly different attributes where walnuts, for example, are higher in polyunsaturated fatty acids. Almonds are higher, for example, in vitamin E, which is quite a powerful antioxidant. So I think to have a combination of nuts is probably better than just having a single type of nut. But I still think a single type of nut will have a huge benefit on health.
Interesting. And in terms of like a dose, if you could speak of such a such a concept in relation to a food, is there an amount that we should all be ingesting on a daily basis, weekly basis that seems to provide the most health benefit, or what?
Yeah, so the evidence around the dose response, and the dose at which you get maximal benefit, isn't really very clear yet. What's clear is that we're not consuming enough nuts, I think, in general as a population. So in the UK and the US, it's estimated that only about 10% in the UK and only about 7% of the US population even consume nuts. And when they do consume nuts, they're only getting about 1% of their energy from nuts. So that's tiny. I can't work out what that is in grams, but we're talking maybe a couple of nuts a day. What's clear from some of the epidemiological evidence, so these big population studies, is if people are having more than 2 servings a week, and a serving is about a handful, that you see about a 20% reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. So even at only a couple of servings a week, we believe that there would be a strong benefit. Some studies do show what we call a dose response effect, i.e. the higher the dose, the bigger the benefit. And studies show even when you're giving really large amounts, like 70 grams, which, is quite a large amount that's probably about 25% of your energy, so about a quarter of your energy coming from nuts, that it's associated with lots of health benefits, and most importantly, doesn't seem to impact your weight control. So it doesn't mean that you're going to put on weight, because obviously they're what we talked about earlier, the energy density.
75 grams a day?
Yeah.
That's about like 3 handfuls worth of nuts, if I had to estimate.
Yeah, that's about. So a typical serving is about 28 grams, and that's a handful. So yeah, that's about 3 servings a day. So that's quite a lot. But you don't need to go that high. Even having a couple of servings a week has a huge benefit.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of all different nuts. Lately I've been just like obsessed with macadamia nuts. We work with a brand called House of Macadamias, and they just make an amazing array of macadamia, infused products, and then whole macadamias with various like dry, seasonings on them. which I love because of the preponderance of super healthy monounsaturated fat. Almonds, as you mentioned, I mean, the vitamin E and the
Yep.
magnesium in almonds are incredible. Pistachios, I think, it's so cool that they're like the only nut with significant quantities of lutein and zeaxanthin in them, which are carotenoids. And then on a daily basis, almost I eat a few Brazil nuts for the selenium.
Okay, you know all the nutrients that are in nuts better than I do.
I'm
I could not have told you all that.
no, well, I'm a bit of a nut nerd, I guess. If you I've always loved them. Do you think there is any merit to the concern about like oxalates and anti-nutrients that people seem to have so much on social media these days?
Do you know, it's something I know hardly anything about. And I think that answers the question in itself, because if it was really important, I think it's something I would know more about. But
People are, but look, people who I just want to be really clear in that, like people who have seen a reprieve from whatever various symptoms they're faced with, from cutting them out of their diet. I mean, I'm happy for them. I just think it's important not, people make these like broad, sweeping,
Mhm,
generalized statements on
mhm.
social media that like all nuts are bad, and I think that that's really problematic.
Yeah, I think it's problematic across so many different foods that people are excluding whole food groups based on the fact that actually 0.5% of the population might have some intolerance or even less than that.
Hmm.
And I think people need to be really cautious excluding really beneficial food groups like nuts, unless they do have a problem and they are seeing a benefit from excluding them.
Exactly. Like there's a proportion of the population that you give them one peanut and they're dead.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that peanuts are healthy for the entirety of the population. And the same thing with like oxalates and any of these foods. I mean,
Yeah.
if histamines, people avoid avocados that are sensitive to histamines. That doesn't mean that avocados are unhealthy foods. It's just crazy,
Yeah.
on social media. Um, the
Well, I use the term nutribolics,
what is that?
just meaning there's loads of absolute nonsense. So there's loads of nutribolics out there on social media.
What are the most pervasive nutritional myths that you see on social media?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I think what we've talked about nuts being so bad for us. I think dairy is another one.
People love to hate on dairy. They think it's like an unclean food.
Exactly. Gluten. I think that so many people avoid gluten unnecessarily, but fine if that's their dietary choice. Um,
Actually, one interview that I watched with you, it turns out you're not a fan of avocado oil
oh, and then seed oils.
and
Oh,
then
that's
seed
another
oils.
myth. Yeah. Oh my
Tell me
gosh.
about that because I'm going to be fully transparent here. I tend to avoid them. I opt primarily for extra virgin olive oil when I'm looking for a fat to
Yep.
use. Uh, and I have my thoughts on
Yep.
on seed oils. But what's your take? Because I love exposing my audience to a diversity of viewpoints, and you're somebody who's been like immersed in this field for 25 years now. So what's your take?
Okay, so I'm going to start off by with a caveat that I start all of my lectures on fat to my students. So I've been teaching the area of dietary fat for the last 25 years. And every lecture I start, I tell the students what I'm telling you now might change in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years as we get more evidence.
Hmm.
So I would like to caveat that. I think the issue that I have about people hitting on seed oils is they use evidence to show, whoa, look at the increase in seed oils over the last, 20 years, and look at the increase in cardiovascular disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancers, etc. And they pin everything on this increase in seed oils. Now, what we need to think about is what foods are those seed oils going in? Those seed oils are going in these really unhealthily, heavily processed or ultra processed foods. And I think that there's too much focus on the seed oils being the demon rather than the food being the demon that they're carried in, rather than the fact that these are oils added outside of the matrix. So again, going back to this idea, so the free oils,
Yeah.
are also forgetting all these other, really bad, or not bad, these really unfavorable nutrients that are also in many of these foods. So the majority of the seed oils that we're consuming are coming from these heavily processed foods. Now, the randomized controlled trials that look at exchanging, different types of saturated fats with seed oils, I think are quite consistent in showing a benefit. There's the odd study that, and I don't remember the name of these two studies, that often the people that are quite anti-seed oils will pull out a quote and misquote. But I think that it's quite clear that the high MUFA, the high PUFA content of the seed oils, together with the micronutrients that are in them, remember these are coming from plants that have their own natural defense mechanisms from the oils oxidizing, so they tend to be really high in like vitamin E and other antioxidant vitamins, and so I don't think there's any clear evidence from randomized control trials to show that they have a negative impact on our health. In fact, I think there's clear evidence to show they have a favorable impact on our health if you take them outside of the foods that we're eating them in.
Yeah, so you would say that, like, for people that are pointing a finger at them and saying that they are the root cause of all of our ills, that's the cart before the horse. It's like you probably, look, if you're ingesting a lot of seed oils, you're probably ingesting
all these other
unhealthy rubbish foods that are, I'm using like English vernacular now. I've been here 4 days. You're putting the cart before the horse, essentially. And when you say seed oils, can we define them? Like, obviously there's certain cultures have been using sesame seed oil for centuries.
Yeah, I think when we talk about seed oils, or when other people talk about seed oils in a negative way, typically they're referring to rapeseed oil, which is the term we use in the UK, or it's called canola oil in the US, or some of the sunflower seed oils. And so it's typically referring to those, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think we were talking about the food matrix with regard to nuts, and that like you couldn't make some of these nut butters ground to the granularity in your own home that you would need like to make them in a plant to be able to replicate, right? I think like for somebody practicing like the precautionary principle, like a non-scientist who just wants to like do best by themselves and their families, like, do you think that there's an argument to be made for, and I know the naturalistic fallacy, like not everything that's natural is good for you, but somebody practicing the precautionary principle that for a fat like a refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oil, a novel fat that, like, I'm not talking about sesame seed oil, I'm talking about like soybean oil, that you couldn't really make this in your own kitchen if you tried. It's something that's like, it's a food product that's heavily marketed, there's ads on TV for it. Maybe I'm just going to hedge my bets and like stick to the extra virgin olive oil, the kinds of fats that like, and feel free to shoot this idea down, please. But that, like, I'm going to stick to something that maybe like humans have been using for a bit longer on the geographic timeline.
Yeah, I mean, I think that without doubt, extra virgin olive oil is the healthiest oil to use. I think the argument about just because we haven't historically consumed this food, this oil, this ingredient, and you couldn't create it in your home, I don't think that's necessarily an argument why not to have it. Now, I know that might somewhat contradict what I was saying earlier, that as much as possible have, the whole food in the way nature intended. But if you think we've been processing foods for hundreds of years, and I think that this goes back to this whole polarization of arguments around processing food and around ultra-processed food versus unprocessed food, that some processing of food I think is actually really beneficial. It can increase the availability of certain nutrients and it can have a favourable impact. And so I think we need to be a little bit too cautious about getting too caught up on, okay, these seed oils we wouldn't be able to go and get that seed and extract it necessarily in our home. I don't think that's necessarily an argument for why it would be bad for us.
Yeah. I mean, I think like also I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with the claim that like, that with the current tools that we have, that we can say that they're universally good for every tissue, every organ. I mean, like, I'm definitely familiar that with the studies that show that you replace saturated fats with these oils and you see, LDL, ApoB go down, which theoretically is going to reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease. But the long-term effects that they have on, for example, brain health. I mean, I'm just, there was There's a researcher whose work I recently found. He's out of UC Davis. His name is Amir Taha, who wrote a great review in 2021. I'll send it to you. It's like on the increase in Western diets of linoleic acid and like potentially the role that it could be playing in brain health outcomes. And it kind of acknowledges some of these knowledge gaps. Not making any claims or anything like that, but just saying like we need more data before we can say with certainty that these fats, especially in the concentration that we're now consuming them in Western diets, is good for the brain. There's some evidence to the contrary. So I don't know.
But I think that goes back to everything with nutrition, and hence why I always tell my students that I might say something different in 5 and 10 years. There's so much we don't know, and we don't know enough about long-term benefits of many different ingredients. I still think based on the current evidence that seed oils, if we put aside the fact that they're in lots of these heavily processed unhealthy foods, that seed oils themselves, I don't believe that the evidence supports them to be having an unhealthy effect on our health.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably very true that people that are obsessing with those fats, are losing sight of the forest for the trees. When you still have so many people walking around overweight and type 2 diabetic, and to be hyper focused on this one food component.
And I think, being hyper focused on any single food component or any single response is not going to be helpful for us. And, I often talk about our health and our food being a puzzle. And if we focus on just one piece of that puzzle, we're firstly probably going to be blooming miserable because we're over focusing on one thing, restricting our diets because of that. But actually, the size impact that that's going to have on your health is going to be small. And we need to be thinking about all the pieces of the puzzle. So, there's this big focus on blood sugar responses. Yes, I think that it has some importance, but actually it's one piece of a big puzzle. There's all this focus on the microbiome. Yes, we believe it's important. There's a lot of emerging evidence. It's an exciting area. But again, it's another piece of the puzzle. And we need to think about all the different pieces, I think.
Why do you think we do that? We hyper-focus on these little granular aspects, losing sight of the big picture so readily.
Well, from my own experience working in nutritional research for 20 plus years, is everyone wants a silver bullet. Everyone wants a magic pill. Take this, do this, done. And so it's very easy to kind of get sucked into, especially now with social media, one focus. Flatline your glucose, you'll cure everything. Feed this particular thing for this particular bug in your microbiome. You'll live 20 years younger, and you'll have a happier life. And that's also why we get these crazy diets, like blood group diet, alkaline diet, because it's like, oh, just one quick fix.
Yeah.
And if there was a quick fix, I wouldn't be sitting here now. I'd be on my luxury yacht somewhere, retired. But there isn't. Food is complicated, and the matrix is a really great example of why it's complicated. And we know as nutritional scientists now that food isn't just 4 nutrients, fat, protein, fiber, carbohydrate. We know that it consists of thousands of chemicals. It's estimated each food to have about 20,000 different chemicals.
Wow.
Now, those 20,000 different chemicals interact with each other. So they all modulate how the other one works. So again, why just looking at a list on one food versus another food is so reductionist. As well as the fact that they all interact with each other, we've got this complex matrix that we talked about that also modulates their effect. And then overlaid with the actual food that you're eating is the complexity of how we as individuals modulate our responses to food, which is where this whole area of personalized nutrition comes in, which I've also spent the last 5 years really focusing on. But then an area that's really understudied, and again, this kind of magic pill or, over focusing on one thing, I don't think therefore addresses, is the area of how we eat. And this is something that I think is such an exciting area. And by how we eat, I mean the time of day that you eat, the speed that you eat, the eating window. So, whether you're practicing time restricted eating, the order of your meals, how much sleep you've had, how much exercise you've done. We know from our own Zoe Predict research that all of these can have almost as much impact on your responses to food as the food itself does.
Wow.
In terms of your health response.
So time of day and then eating rate, which is
Yep.
an area you've done a lot of work on.
Yep.
So talk to me about some of these variables. I mean, obviously there's a lot, and we don't have like an infinite amount of time, but like where would you suggest that people like, you know, 80-20 rule, like where should people be putting the majority of their focus?
So I think perhaps to take a step back, because I'm conscious that we're now exploring all the different bits that I get excited with, from food matrix to...
I love it. And you're a wonderful communicator. So I mean, I could sit here with you all day, but I know we're limited on time.
Thank you. So I think to take a step back and just put everything in context so that I'm not confusing everyone that's listening. I think when we think about the health effects of food, I think we should break it down according to 4 key points. One is the food that you're eating, and this is where the matrix comes in and all of these thousands of chemicals and bioactives and nutrients. Who you are, your age, your sex, your body composition, whether you're pre or postmenopausal, your microbiome, etc. And then, as well as what you're eating, who you are, how you eat is the other key factor, which is where all of these things like time of day, eating rate. And then something we mustn't forget is, why do you make those dietary choices? Why are you choosing the food that you're choosing? Now, if we can tackle all of those 4, we need to think about them all at the same time, I think, to improve people's health. And so we've talked a little bit about the food that you eat with the matrix. But yeah, if you're happy for me to, I'd love to talk about how you eat.
Yes, I would love to hear, yeah.
So there's lots of different factors. For example, there's time of day. So the time of day that you're eating can impact how you respond to that, how much sleep you've had, your eating rate, your eating window. And I can touch on each of these quite briefly.
Please.
So if we take sleep, for example, we know from our own, again, Zoe Predict research, that if you have a good night's sleep versus a bad night's sleep, it changes your response to your food the next day. So let's say you've had a bad night's sleep, which I did last night because my daughter woke me up several times in the night.
Oh, no.
Fortunately, my husband sleeps through everything, but I don't. So when I have my breakfast this morning, even if it's the same as what I had yesterday for breakfast, I'm going to have a higher blood sugar response than if I'd had it the day before, when actually I had a wonderful night's sleep. And so that's having 2, and we know this from our own studies where we've given people exactly the same breakfasts, and we've looked at what their sleep patterns, how whether they've had a good night's sleep or bad night's sleep impacts their post-meal, so postprandial glycemic response, so post-meal blood sugar response. And we see on the day that people have a poorer night's sleep, they have a higher blood sugar response, which we know it can be unfavourable.
What would be the consequences of that?
So I think it's important to say that a high blood sugar response in itself isn't unfavourable. It's a normal physiological response to consuming sugar. We don't need to be flatlining. I know lots of people are now wearing continuous glucose monitors, monitoring their glucose. I'd say please don't over stress about it. It is a normal response. But what we do know is that when you have a high blood sugar response, it sets off this kind of cascade of downstream effects. It can trigger inflammation, oxidative stress, for example. And so what we believe is that if you have very excessive, repeated, extensive peaks, that there will be in the long term unfavourable downstream health effects from this inflammatory and oxidative stress response. But I know that you mentioned this earlier. The problem is we don't know whether these large responses are necessarily because we have underlying issues going on in the first place that are causing these high responses. And but where it's really interesting is to look at within a person, how things differ day to day. And this is why sleep, for example, is really great, because it's like, okay, regardless of what else is underlying, if you have a bad night's sleep, you have a worse blood sugar response compared to when you've had a good night's sleep. And so I think this just shows again how we need to think holistically about not just even food, not even just how we eat, but all these other pillars of health like stress, like sleep and physical activity, because they all interact to shape how we respond to food.
Is that why when people are underslept, they tend to consume more calories the following day? It's like putting a mechanism to that observation that people tend to consume somewhere between 400 and 500 additional calories the following day.
Yeah, so there's some research that have looked at poor sleepers and good sleepers, and also looked at changing sleep day to day. And what happens is if you've had a poor night's sleep, the reward centers in your brain are kind of heightened. So what's happening is your brain is actually saying, hey, go and please eat all of this food that's going to give me a quick fix. And so these tend to be the kind of foods that are high in refined carbohydrates, at very heavily processed foods. And so that's one mechanism. The other could be that you have these foods that are high in carbohydrate, plus you have a higher blood sugar response, and then you get a dip in your blood sugar about 2 to 4 hours after. And we've seen from our own research, people that have a big dip in blood sugar versus a small dip in blood sugar have about a 300 calorie difference in their energy intake,
wow,
which is huge. And if we look at people day to day and see if you dip one day versus not dipping another day based on your food choices, even within a person. So depending on, let's say, Max, you dip today and you don't dip in your blood sugar responses at breakfast, we see again still about 120 calorie difference in the food that you're going to eat over that day,
wow,
just based on whether you dip.
Wow. So it does poor sleep, but even these like high glycemic foods can perpetuate.
Exactly.
Hunger.
So your brain is saying, basically go and eat rubbish food, and then your metabolism is also not able to process them as well because of the poor night's sleep. So you've got two things happening with the sleep, as well as lots of other stuff. You might not be wanting to exercise because you're shattered. And
I had pretty poor sleep last night too. I mean, I feel like I've adjusted pretty well to being on England time, but I think it might have caught up to me last night because my sleep was just really bad. But
the whole area of circadian biology and chrononutrition, which is all around eating according to your body clock, the work with shift workers and jet lag.
Have you collaborated with Sachin Panda at all?
No, but I love his work.
Yeah, he's a great scientist. I've had him on multiple times on the show. We're friends at this point. That's fascinating. Okay, so and then what about in other ways in which we eat that matter? Eating rate is
so
something that you
eating
touched
rate
on.
is something I'm really excited about as well. Well, as you can tell, I get excited about a lot
I
of
love
work
it.
we're doing.
So do I.
It's because I'm actively researching it, and this is what I think, as a nutritional scientist, why we get so passionate, and probably why we get quite polarized as well sometimes, because when you're investing your time, your energy and your passion into actually conducting these trials, I think that we get very excited about these areas. So eating rate is something that is a really exciting new area of research, and what we know is the speed at which you eat your food can impact your metabolic responses to that food and can impact your energy intake. And so we know, again, from our own Zoe Predict research, that if we were to look at fast eaters versus slow eaters, that people that tend to eat their meals quickly consume about 200 calories more a day than those that consume their foods more slowly. We also know from randomized controlled trials that if you ask people to slow down the rate that they're eating, they tend to lose more weight than if you were not to ask someone to do that.
Wow.
And there's this great study in people with obesity in adolescence, where people were asked to put their plate on one of these kind of weighing scales that would beep if they were eating too quickly. And there was another group that weren't given the same weighing scales that beeped. And just by reminding these individuals to slow down the rate at which they're eating by this buzzer going
What a
off,
cool device.
they lost more weight.
Wow.
They lost, and so the weight loss in these obese adolescents was a lot greater than the other individuals. And they weren't told to change the kind of food that you're eating. It was just reducing the speed. And this is another mechanism why ultra-processed food might be unfavourable for us. And there's some lovely research that's been done by a group in the US under Kevin Hall's leadership, where he randomly allocated groups of individuals to either have a very highly processed, so ultra-processed diet, or an unprocessed diet for a couple of weeks. Now, nutritionally, they were matched, same fat, fibre, protein, carbohydrate. Not 100% matched, but close enough. And what he found is those that had the ultra-processed food, they tended to eat their food 50% more quickly than those that had the unprocessed, even though they were nutritionally matched.
Wow.
And we know, therefore, that you're eating more quickly. So what's happening is that it takes about 10 to 20 minutes for your hunger and your fullness signals to kick in. And so means that you're eating so quickly that your fullness signals coming from your fullness hormones that are in the lower part of your gut are feeding back at a point in which you finished all the food because you've eaten it so quickly. So that's why you could tend to overeat if you eat too quickly. We also know, again, from our own research, that people eat more quickly tend to have a quicker and higher blood sugar response. And we know that will also impact some of the downstream gut hormones telling us how full we are and how hungry we are.
Wow. I think people fail to realize that like digestion begins before you even take your first bite.
Absolutely. And do you know what? If we could just say to people, look, put your knife and fork down between each mouthful. I'm not suggesting that everyone spends an hour having their lunch or that, you have some weighing scale. But unfortunately now, and particularly post-COVID, where many people are working at home, a lot of people are eating their breakfast, their lunch, or I certainly am, in front of a Zoom meeting. I'm not mindfully even thinking about what I'm shoveling in. I'm shoveling it in quickly before I have to say the next thing that I have to say. And so what that means then is that we're eating it at a higher speed, and we're not allowing those those fullness signals to kick in. We're not allowing the suitable metabolic responses. So it's taking us back to trying to eat in a more traditional way where we're not trying to do 100 things at once, but we're just eating.
Wow. So the takeaway, be present with your food.
Yep.
Be present with your food. Make sure that you're observing, smelling the food, getting all those like digestive juices flowing. And try to eat more slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think if you could just try and maybe put your knife and fork down a little bit between each mouthful.
I'm a fast eater. I'm like, people make fun. Like maybe it's because I grew up in a family of 3 boys. I was like the firstborn, and of 3 boys, and whenever the food came to the table, we all like it was like a free for all. We all clamored, so you just wanted to get as much food in your face as possible. Yeah.
My husband's one of 4, and we were discussing this yesterday, funnily enough, and he was saying, but it's all about survival of the fittest. And he has this motto: you snooze, you lose. And he was like, when the food came on the table, we were just eating it. And surely this goes back like hundreds and hundreds of years. Surely we adapted to quickly eat that food. But I think if you think even before that, hunt and gatherers, that I don't think you were. You'd eat as and when little bits that you could find.
Yeah. Well, but I think also going back to the food matrix is like there's a rate limiting effect of whole foods that you don't get with ultra processed foods.
Yeah, there's a professor based in the Netherlands, Kieran Ford, that's done a lot of work around eating rate, food matrix, and the consistency and texture of food. And he's done some really interesting work where he's looked at 4 main types of food. So he's looked at ultra processed soft food, unprocessed soft food. Now, don't ask me examples for these, because that would be putting me on the spot. Ultra-processed hard food and unprocessed hard food. And what he finds is that and people are just left free living to eat at the speed that they want to, but nutritionally matched. The ultra-processed soft foods are eaten the quickest. The unprocessed soft foods, the next quickest. Then the ultra-processed hard foods the next quickest, and then the ultra-processed I've got lost now.
The unprocessed food, like the hardest food,
Yes,
probably got eaten the slowest,
yes.
right?
But yes, and it's all about the texture. So whether it's processed or unprocessed, if it's soft, it's going to be eaten more quickly. But then the ultra-processed hard food will still be eaten more quickly than the minimally or unprocessed hard food.
Well, it's fast. I mean, even nuts, right? Like we had to shell nuts for the vat.
Yeah.
Like if you had to shell your own nuts, right? Like you'd probably eat a lot fewer of them than now. I mean, even whole nuts are processed in the way that they're removed from their shells.
Yeah.
The way that most people will consume them.
But you're still having to chew quite a lot. You still can't get loads in one go. But if you take apple or pureed apple,
that sounds like a test, like a challenge.
Yeah, we could do a challenge on that.
I mean, you put some salted pistachio nuts in my hand, like
Okay.
I can eat those. I can go through those pretty quickly. They're so tasty.
But if you were to take, let's say, whole fruit versus exactly the same fruit in a smoothie, the rate at which you could eat those is vastly different. You could eat that pint of that smoothie that's coming from those fruits in probably 2 minutes. You could drink that.
Hmm.
But yet it would take you probably 5 to 10 minutes to actually eat the fruit in that original state.
Are smoothies making us fat, sick?
Oh, I don't know. That's a hard one. I mean, I think it's clear that they can be consumed more quickly. It's clear that they can, because of changing the matrix, so breaking down that structure, that they can actually, increase some of our metabolic responses in an unfavorable way. But I do think any way that we can encourage people to consume more plant-based foods, so fruits or vegetables,
Yeah.
even if it's in a smoothie, personally, I think it's better for them than not consuming.
Well,
Absolutely.
smoothies are actually, now that I think about it, and now that I'm talking to you, actually a wonderful kind of example of a food where you're maintaining the fiber
Mhm.
and water in a smoothie, right? A smoothie is not a juice. A smoothie is like you're taking the whole
Yep.
fruit. All you're doing is modulating the eating rate
Yep.
at which you're able to consume those fruits, right? So whereas you might be satiated from like a whole apple or a small handful of blueberries, suddenly in a smoothie you're consuming lots and lots of fruits at a much quicker rate,
Yep.
and probably you're probably consuming a lot more than you would otherwise. Like if you were left to eat only the whole fruit.
Yeah. So you've got two things happening there. You've got one, the fact that you can eat it more quickly. So you're eating the same energy, but actually loads more quickly.
Hmm.
So you're not having time for your hunger signals to say, hey, I've had enough. Let's not eat that, fifth apple that was in that smoothie.
Yeah.
But even though the fiber's still in there, you've actually broken down some of that structure. So if we go back to the oats example that I used earlier, you still had the same kind of fiber, but you've just broken it down.
Hmm.
And that's what's happening with the smoothie as well. So you're breaking it down. So as well as drinking it more quickly, it's becoming more of a fast food. So you know how before I talked about kind of a slow food and fast food? Not only are you drinking it at a higher speed, but your body's processing it at a higher speed because the natural kind of cell wall structure is partly destroyed.
Are there any ultra processed foods that are good for us?
So I think, again, this is an area that's so contentious. I think that we need to be really mindful that ultra processed foods are a lot cheaper for many individuals, depending on where you shop. They can be a lot cheaper. They can also be a lot safer because a lot of the preservatives added mean they have a long shelf life. Some ultra processed foods can enable certain nutrients to be more accessible to us. And so I think we need to take it on a food by food basis. I think where the problem comes is that it's quite nuanced about whether a food is healthy or unhealthy. And lots of people are saying, oh, we should just say an ultra processed food is bad and an unprocessed food is good for us. And I think there's some overlap. I think to say an individual ultra processed food is really good for us, we need to be a little bit cautious about. But I think that there is, and we've seen this from some research that we've done, there's about 15 to 20% of foods that, according to the ultra processed classification, which is called the NOVA classification, if we were to classify them, about 20% of foods, in my opinion, based on the research we've done, would be wrongly classified as being unhealthy. So they would be called an ultra processed food, but actually we know from our own knowledge as nutritional researchers, we know from all of this epidemiological, so population-based science, that they're not healthy. You're putting me on the spot to try and remember the exact food. So
Well, what if
I did have a list.
I regularly use, like, I take protein shakes. Would that be considered an ultra processed food?
I don't know whether protein shakes are classed as an ultra processed food because individual ingredients aren't processed as an ultra processed
Got
food.
it.
So it kind of comes down to semantics.
Yeah.
But I think what we need to be mindful of is some processing enables us to consume a wider variety of food, and some processing is good for us. And there's a project that I've been involved with at King's College London that's led by Paul Sharp, a professor at King's, who has been looking at how we can process wheat to make it better for us, in simple terms. So we know in the UK and the US, iron deficiency anemia is a really big problem. We know that many people aren't getting enough iron from plant-based foods. Now, we know that when you have whole grain wheat, the iron is trapped within a layer of cells called the alurone layer, and it's really resistant to digestion, a little bit like when we talked about the nuts, that it's coming out the other end. So it's all very well saying, again, on the back of pack labelling, oh, it's whole grain, it's got loads of iron in it. We're not absorbing it, it's coming out mostly. And there's a technique called micromilling, and this technique called micromilling, which is what we've been working on developing, actually breaks down this alurone layer so that the iron and also the zinc that's in this alurone layer is released. And so what we can do is we can then add it back into white flour or whole grain flour, so that we can create a flour that is packed full of both iron and zinc that we can actually absorb. And I think that's a really good example where processing can actually improve the healthiness of a food.
What about just adding vitamin C? Doesn't that help with iron absorption from plant-based foods?
So that will help the bioavailability, so how much we absorb. But if you've got the iron trapped within these cells of the alurone, they're not even coming out.
Wow.
So there's two terms we often use. So one is bioaccessibility, and bioaccessibility is a term that refers to how much of the nutrients are even available to us. So the almonds is a great example where actually the fat and everything in those cells wall isn't even available to us, it's coming out. And again, this is what happens with the iron and zinc in the alurone layer. It's not bioaccessible. And then bioavailable is about how efficient our body is in then absorbing that nutrient. So what the micromilling will do is it will make the iron and zinc more bioaccessible. So it's actually then circulating in a free form. Add the vitamin C in, then yeah, you've got magic.
Oh, man. I would just eat a steak. That's my favorite.
Oh, so would I. Nice and pink.
I love it. I love it. What is like the main areas of contention where your perspective deviates from other colleagues that you work with? You said that we've had Dr. Tim Spector on the podcast in the past, and you said that you guys have a friendly debate about certain topics. What are some of those the more prevalent areas of divergent viewpoints?
So I think that generally in the nutrition community, there's a lot of divergent viewpoints about the value of ultra-processed versus minimally processed food. That's the current hot topic. I think that lots of nutritional scientists disagree on areas where we don't have enough evidence yet, or rather disagree on nuances where we don't actually where the kind of pragmatism is a little bit different. So, for example, I hold the opinion that butter is very bad for our health. If we were to use all of the randomized controlled trials that show that butter compared to spreads actually have an unfavorable impact on many different cardiovascular outcomes. Tim, for example, wouldn't agree with that, but that's because he takes a pragmatic approach that, okay, we don't actually consume that much butter. And so based on the amount of butter that we actually do consume, it doesn't really matter. So a lot of it isn't necessarily that we as nutritional scientists are saying you're wrong and I'm right, although obviously I'm right and Tim's wrong all the time. He's just coming around to that way of thinking. It's more that there's scientists like myself that are quite puristic and we're looking at the evidence, and then you've got scientists like Tim that are actually thinking, well, how does this actually apply? What's the pragmatic output from this?
Do you do any butter whatsoever?
Oh gosh, yeah. I'm a great believer in
do as I say, not as I do.
Well, I don't preach, I present the evidence. I'm a great believer in eat what you enjoy. Food is part of our culture, it's part of our emotions, it's part of our society. How do we celebrate? We celebrate over a meal, typically, and maybe with a few glasses of wine. It's there to be enjoyed. And I think this is the worry I have with, over the last 10, 15 years, the explosion of social media and the explosion of everyone's obsession about nutrition, is we've got to remember it's there to bring us joy, what we eat. And for certainly at home, I instill in my children that it's about the pleasure of food. I try and give them reasonably healthy food, but if they enjoy something, I don't want to ever demonize a food. And so I don't want to spread margarine, even though I believe it's better for you, on my toast. I know lots of people don't hold that view. I want to spread butter. I like the texture, I like the taste of butter, so that's what I choose.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.